Hello, everyone. This is Webchat number 17 by my count, and we're glad to have you all here. Welcome to everyone. We have Crystal Farmer with us tonight, and I'm really excited about that. It's my first chance to get to know her, so it's wonderful to have her along. Crystal is an engineer turned educator from North Carolina. She became the organizer for Charlotte CoHousing in 2016 and has been involved in CoHousing and the institutional communities movement ever since. She's passionate about encouraging people to change their perspectives on diversity and relationships and the world. And she owns Big Sister Team Building and teaches at Gastonia Freedom School and Agile Learning Center. And she is with us tonight to talk about housing segregation and its impact on co-housing. So I am excited about this topic. It's one that I don't know a whole lot about, so I am eager to learn. And I'm going to hand it off to Crystal.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. I just wanted to, I'm glad you gave me this opportunity to do the web chat. We're going to talk a little bit about housing segregation and my experience about learning about it and how it affects co-housing. I've been part of Charlotte CoHousing for about 3 or 4 years now, and we're still a forming group, so we're still trying to find land and get enough people to have momentum, and part of that lack of momentum comes from the way that Charlotte is segregated by race. So Charlotte has a large African American population, large white population, and they don't live in the same places. And we're going to talk about why that is across the country in this presentation. So first about me, I am, like she said, I am a teacher during the day. I work with Charlotte CoHousing. I have a little business called Big Sister Team Building, and that's the website you can go to, bigsisterteams.com, if you want to get in contact with me. And a couple of notes about this presentation is that it may be upsetting, it may be difficult to hear, it may be uncomfortable, because we're going to talk about something called white supremacy. And that is the idea that people who are white or who pass as white have more privilege than other people, and especially Black people in the United States. And so we're going to talk about how that has caused our housing conditions to be vastly different among different races. So we're saying that white supremacy is a system, is not a character flaw. It doesn't mean that anybody in particular is a bad person, but it does inspire us all to be anti-racist and to fight against systemic oppression. And I'll have some resources at the end so you can see more about what I'm talking about. So this first one, I'm going to talk about what redlining is. So there was an organization back in the 30s called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And they were one of the first organizations across the country to get together and say, well, we want to decide when people buy their homes, what mortgages are going to be a good bet and what are going to be a bad bet. So they went to several different cities, you can see on the map across the country, and they drew these lines called housing security. So when they drew these lines, they used red for the undesirable neighborhoods, they used blue for the desirable, and green for desirable, and then yellow for kind of in the middle. So what they were doing was actually drawing lines around neighborhoods by race. So at that time, you would have white Europeans who were more desirable, lower class whites, maybe Eastern European whites were less desirable, Black people were even less desirable. And then you had, smaller populations of Hispanic and Asians at that time. So what happened is that the Homeowners Loan Corporation drew these maps and they gave them to banks and realtors to say, this is where your people probably want to invest. And this would have been ancient history if the FHA hadn't taken these maps and kind of codified them into law. So you can see on the slide, the FHA, which is the Federal Housing Administration, made some guidelines that were very explicit about racial mixing. They lowered the security rating of a neighborhood if it had inharmonious racial groups. So if there were whites and Blacks living together, they said that was a worse value for insuring a mortgage. And if it was a white neighborhood, they would say that's a better value for your mortgage. So these rules weren't outlawed until 1968. And if you think about where you live, and how long your city has been around, you can imagine the impact that those kind of lines would have on your neighborhood. So what we have next are a couple of charts. So this one is Lynchburg, Virginia. This is showing first the red line map on the left that shows the original map that was drawn in the 1930s. On the right, you have what's called a racial dot map. So that's actually a map that shows, in 2010, it shows each person as a dot. So this shows the Black people are going to be green, white people are the blue, other races are mixed in there. So you can see those lines are clearly demarcated, and it's not just the rivers that are stopping them, it's not just streets. It's a very specific pattern, and it matches the pattern of the red lines and the blue lines that are on the red line map. So the next slide is going to be Charlotte, North Carolina. And Charlotte has a very particular history with racial housing segregation because of busing, which I'll talk about later. But Charlotte had the same thing done where they had different areas that were outlined based on their desirability. And you can see now Charlotte in 2010 has a very distinct pattern of Black neighborhoods in the west and to the north, and then white neighborhoods down in the south. And so they call it the wedge. So there's this kind of wedge of white neighborhoods, and that's where everybody wants to be. That's where all the growth is. That's where people say the good schools are and things like that. So you can imagine if we're trying, as a co-housing forming group, if we're trying to decide where to live, and our group is majority white, they're gonna say, well, we wanna live in these nice neighborhoods because of the association with Black neighborhoods as far as crime, bad schools, and all of that. So my argument is that this association was created by federal housing policies all the way back in the 30s. So another thing that neighborhoods did was they made restrictive covenants. And these were restrictions that were put on your deed when you bought a house. And this was a way that neighbors kept out other races from their neighborhood. So if there was a neighborhood and there was a house for sale, they could put on the deed that says you're only going to sell this house to other white people. And the deed, you can't buy the house if you're gonna plan on selling it or subletting it to Black people. The flyer you see is for Levittown. You may remember that Levittown is a huge suburb that was formed after the baby boom in the 50s. Suburbs were generally closed to Black families. The FHA did not insure mortgages for Black families in the suburbs. So that was another way that the federal government created kind of housing segregations by saying that we're not going to give mortgages to Black families that want to move out of the city. We're going to keep them in the city. So what happens when you have a certain population of people in the city, you have disinvestment, you have less upkeep of the houses and the buildings, you have more crime as a result, you have schools that don't have enough funding, and you basically create the conditions of what we call the inner city poverty problem. And we can trace a direct line between the way that federal housing policies were created in the 30s all the way to the 50s, and to the crime and the wealth gap and the achievement gap that Black families have today. So the 1964 Fair Housing Act was the act that tried to kind of even out some of this inequality. It guaranteed that FHA loans would go to people of all races, but we know that that wasn't exactly put into place. When we talk about school desegregation, that started with Brown versus Board of Education. In some places, especially in North Carolina, it wasn't completed until the 70s. This picture of Dorothy Counts is when she was trying to integrate Harding High School in Charlotte in 1956. She had to drop out after 4 days because of the hate and the bullying that she was getting. So What happens when you have housing segregation is that you have schools that have inequalities based on the number of students that and the wealth of those students' parents. So in Charlotte, like I showed you with the green and the orange graphs, there's a very distinct lack of diversity in some of the schools, and then there's a huge number of minority majority schools. What Charlotte did, once segregation was enforced by the courts, they started a busing program. So that was, they took kids from one side of the Charlotte and took them to the other side of Charlotte. So they mixed schools so that they were racially integrated. Busing ended in Charlotte in the 2000s based on another court case. And since then, all of the schools have resegregated. So you have schools that are either majority Black or majority white. There isn't the even number of mixed races that there used to be when the schools were being bused. And this has a lot of effects on the kids, especially when if they're in a school with a lot of high poverty students, with a lot of high needs students, they're not going to get as good of an education as if they were in a school that had fewer needs. So when you have a teacher who has maybe 7 special needs kids, 7 homeless kids, other kids with behavioral problems, you have a lot that you have to work with. You have a lot of stress. And if that school is strapped for resources economically, then you're already having where you can only give out so much support to students. Whereas if you were in a wealthy school district and you had only a few students who had those needs because they came from a life of privilege, they came from families that could give them the support that they needed, or had the money to buy, academic services, occupational therapy, speech therapy, things like that, instead of depending on the school system, you have a lot less stress in that school because of the resources that are available. And so that's what's happened in Charlotte and a lot of schools and cities around the country. So another thing that stops the desegregation of housing is something called homeowners associations, and that's something that we're all familiar with as far as how they help neighborhoods, kind of manage themselves. Well, homeowners associations are a direct descendant of the restrictive covenants that we talked about before, because homeowners associations were agreements between the homeowners to not sell their homes to people of a different racial group. So a lot of homeowners associations were formed after the Fair Housing Act and were used to keep minority people from buying homes in their neighborhood. Another thing that we see currently, you see this picture of Barbecue Becky, another thing that we see is kind of the policing of Black people in other neighborhoods. So you may live in a majority white neighborhood and you may know a few Black people who live in your neighborhood. It's almost a guarantee that people who live in that neighborhood have had experiences where somebody questioned if they should be there. Somebody said, where do you live? They may have even had the cops called on them. And that's just a factor of the expectation that if you're living in a majority white neighborhood, that everybody's going to kind of fit in and look the same. Whereas when Black people move into majority white spaces, they kind of create a dissonance. And even middle class white families, if they live in a majority white neighborhood, they're not seen as a middle class family, they're seen as a Black family. And all those associations of poverty, of crime, drug use, all of those stereotypes follow them no matter what level their wealth is. So, like I said, this is not something that has gone away. In 2012, the federal the Housing and Urban Development did a study. They sent out testers. So they sent out African Americans, Hispanics, and white testers to realtors, to banks, to insurance companies, and they all went through the process of trying to get a loan. And what they found was that the African Americans and Latinos were shown fewer homes, they were told about fewer listings, they were asked more questions about their qualifications, they were steered to specific communities, these communities that were redlined, that were already majority minority communities. they were required to provide notice before viewing the houses, and they were given higher loan rates and fewer discounts on closing costs. So you can think about when you're trying to create a co-housing community and you have people of color who want to join your community, you can imagine the difficulty they might find in actually hearing about your community because the realtor may decide that they're not a good fit. They may have more trouble getting a mortgage, even if they meet the financial qualifications. And once they get into that community, they may experience some alienation because they're not of the same culture as the majority of the community. So even now, there's still some advantage to being white and living in America and, you know, being able to have some privilege. So another example is that there are about 70% of white families own their homes, whereas in the African American community, it's about 40%. And that goes back to the FHA and the baby boom not being able to, not allowing Black families to own homes. And so what you have with a lot of Black families is that they've been renting, you know, and instead of passing on a home and that home equity and the wealth that they built up from having that home, you know, Levittown probably has very expensive houses now that can sell for a lot and give them a lot of wealth. Instead, you have Black families having, you know, 10 times as little wealth as white families do nowadays. And that can be tied directly to housing. So what are the implications for co-housing? So what's true is that you're going to probably be looking for a location that, you know, meets your needs as far as schools and shopping and crime. And that community is probably going to be a majority white community. And that's just because of the history that we've talked about. If you want to have diversity in your community, you not only have to look for locations that are in diverse places, but you have to recruit people who are diverse. It's not that Black people don't want to live in other neighborhoods or that they don't want to live with people. It's that they don't always have the opportunity, and sometimes they are openly discriminated against by realtors and mortgage companies. So when you are trying to attract people to co-housing, you have to kind of go outside of your network. You know, you probably have a church, maybe a coffee shop that you like going to, a book club. And if you think about those places where you go, do they have a lot of diversity or do they don't? So a lot of co-housing connections are about, you know, finding who you know who might be interested and who has similar interests as you. So what you have to do is say, okay, well, is there a Black church? Is there a Hispanic church? Is there a Korean church where I can talk to people who might be interested in co-housing? Is there another neighborhood organization that does similar work as to what we're doing and is trying to create a community? That's the way that you can get other people into your group. The next biggest thing you can do is ask people of color if they can help you be more diverse and reach out to other people. Don't just walk up to the first Black person or your best friend who's Black and ask them, you know, why aren't Black people in co-housing? The best thing to do is to reach out to people in your neighborhood who are already community leaders, people like me who do speaking engagements about diversity, and ask them to review your materials, to have a sit down and talk to you about what you've been doing on your website, your messaging, and then go through a process of anti-oppression training. Do some training so that you can learn about what implicit bias is and how it affects you, even subconsciously when you're not thinking about it. And then once you've done some of that training, take it out to the rest of your community. Talk to your other community members about bias, about housing segregation, and about what you want to do as far as creating a diverse co-housing community. All right, so this last slide just has some, all the resources that I talked about with the pictures of redlining. The racial dot map covers the entire United States. So it's really fun to go and find your neighborhood and see the kind of borders around, you know, the different racial groups where you live. I went to Arlington a few months ago, Arlington, Virginia, and I could almost see the difference, you know, where the lines were between different neighborhoods, just because of, you can tell that in some neighborhoods, the houses were owned by the homeowners, and in some neighborhoods, the houses were owned by people who are renting out the houses. And what happens is when somebody is renting out the house, they're not as big on upkeep, or if they're paying a higher mortgage rate, they don't have the funds to remodel the house as often. So you have this deterioration of neighborhoods. And then you have gentrification, which is a new thing that I didn't mention on the slide, but gentrification is when wealthier families come in and buy up property, and by increasing the home values and the and attracting more buyers to the area, they're kind of pushing out the people who already live there, who are usually people of color and people who are poor. So gentrification is something that happens. It's something that we have to think about in co-housing as well. But when we are conscious about how we're moving in spaces and what we're doing as far as considering our neighbors, we can be better stewards of the whole world that we've been given, and we can be more fair to the other people. So that's all my presentation.
Thank you so much. Lots of interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And things I didn't know. I mean, I knew some, but I didn't know all of it for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what we typically do at this point is open it up for questions. So if anyone has a question, you're welcome to put it in the chat, or you're also welcome to unmute yourself and just ask it. So questions or responses, comments about what you've heard?
So I have a question, Karen.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Crystal, thank you very much for that really great presentation. I appreciate it. And I like the idea that you had of look for a Korean church, Hispanic church, Black church. Can you tell me, so how do I do that? I'm a white person. Do I call and talk to the pastor? Do I walk in during a Sunday morning service? That seems a little awkward. What do I do? How do I do that?
It depends on how outgoing you are. I think what I would say to do is reach out to the leadership. So maybe just, call the pastor and say, let's have a sit down. I want to, reach out to people at your church because I think they should be part of our community. And, you can, by talking to the leadership, you can get a good idea of how to approach people and whether they're receptive to hearing from other people. So.
Okay. So the leadership would tell me whether or not they were interested in, I mean, they might say, oh, great, we've got a meeting, why don't you come and speak? Or they might say, well, nobody here is probably interested, so.
Yeah, I mean, they'll be realistic. If all of their congregation are renters and don't have, the money to own, then they can tell you that. So it helps save you time.
Right, okay. I also just want to comment that we're in about the same position your group is. It's really hard, isn't it?
Yes, very hard.
A lot of work.
I call us the ever-forming group.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Good question. Thank you. Christina, I see you're unmuted. Did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I got on the call a bit late. Sorry about joining late. Crystal, thank you for your presentation. I'm coming out of Maryland. I just had a question. I wanted to find out, I might have missed this, and sorry if it was already said, but Crystal, do you have experience living in or are currently in a co-housing community?
No, so I'm part of Charlotte Co-Housing, and we're a forming community. I haven't lived in community at all yet. I have my little neighborhood that I live in that I call Co-Housing Light, but it's not an official co-housing community. Since I've been involved with co-housing, I've been to the Communities Conference, I've been to several co-housing communities and other kinds of intentional communities. So that's just my connection right now, is being able to talk to a lot of people about it.
Great, thank you for that. And one other question. As a African-American single mom, of what are some things that I should consider and be mindful of when looking into co-housing community?
A big thing I would say is just the intergenerational aspect. There's some co-housing communities that are, really excited about having kids and want to have, a lot of different age mixing. And then there are some communities that want to focus maybe on aging in place and having, that kind of senior community. So one of the things you have to look at is like, how well are they going to tolerate kids? And you can kind of figure that out when you meet with co-housing groups, if they have childcare or if they have kids running around, or if there's, lots of older people, you can kind of get a sense of how that group kind of deals with children. As far as race, you're gonna definitely want to, notice how they talk about race and interact with other people who are a different race from them. It's really easy for people to say, oh, we're liberal, we're very race conscious, and we want diversity. But the reality is that a lot of people are very comfortable with their privilege, and they don't recognize that it's privilege. And when that's challenged, it gets them into a really uncomfortable spot. So it's really important just to, before you get too involved with the group, to understand their level of race consciousness and kind of decide if you're comfortable with that.
Great. Thank you very much, Crystal.
Other questions? Thank you, Christina. So I have one, so I'll chime in, Crystal, if I can. So based on the advice you just gave, which I think makes a lot of sense, I think for a lot of white folks, and I'll speak for myself, not knowing, like wanting to be genuinely welcoming and wanting to be diverse and wanting to be flexible and understanding of that experience, but not having grown up with it. What are the things you'd advise a community to do to be not just in name, but genuinely welcoming of people of other races?
Yeah, so, you sent that email a couple of days ago, and that's really prescient because, Joe Cole at the National CoHousing Conference is going to be giving a presentation about anti-racism. And I think it's really important for communities together to go through some kind of training, some kind of, workshop, so they can, think about their own bias and then talk about it with other community members. So you have to be aware of it before you can do anything about it. So it's great to want to, be diverse, but there's a lot of ways that people go about diversity that is actually harmful to people of color. So that's why it's important to hear from experienced trainers how to do this process and what to say, what not to say.
So get some training.
Yep.
Do you have any sort of top couple of like biggest mistakes that well-intentioned white people make?
Yeah. So one thing that people do, especially when they're like, I'm a single mom, when they, see me and they see my daughter and they think, oh, she's beautiful, and it's like, you must have worked really hard. They're automatically assuming that I'm, at a lower wealth status than they are, a lower class. And that's something that's hurtful to hear, even though, I am, maybe at a different socioeconomic status. It's not okay to assume that for people. And people make a lot of assumptions when they see people and they don't recognize that those are assumptions. So another thing is about education. So I have 2 bachelor's degrees, and a lot of Black women are, college graduates right now. And so for people to say, oh, that's so great that you, made it through college, that's another thing that can be perceived as, wow, I didn't expect you to complete college because of your race. Things like that.
So a lot about assumptions and unaware assumptions. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I can say when it comes to housing, there's a lot of ways that communities talk about different parts of the city, and that kind of reveals their bias about housing. one thing you'll see is that people talk about the inner city, and Charlotte has an inner city. We showed that kind of orange area that has a lot of Black people in it. And when people talk about the inner city, they're using that as a reference to say, oh, well, this is a neighborhood that's poor, this neighborhood has more crime, this neighborhood has worse schools. And that can be really hurtful for people who are from those communities and maybe doing work to help make those communities better. And like I said, this housing segregation is part of a whole federal policy as well as white supremacy. So it's kind of, you kind of have to check your assumptions about different parts of an area, you know, where you're looking for housing.
Makes a lot of sense.
So I have a comment too, if I can. So Crystal, I realized that I didn't say anything really about your presentation, and it wasn't new information to me.
Mm-hmm.
If I was hearing your presentation, the information in your presentation for the first time, I would be shocked. Mm-hmm. And I was shocked the first time I heard it. So what I realized is that I didn't make any comment about that. It is appalling what has happened at the federal level. I mean, mm-hmm. it's just appalling. So you did a nice job of describing it in a really neutral, detached way, because it's always a touchy thing.
Yeah.
So thank you really for the information and for helping all of us understand, because as a white person, I can tell you, I can't really know what it feels like. I can understand it. I've had education about it. I've had training about it, and I understand it intellectually, but I don't really know how it feels. I know I can walk into, actually no, we walked into 6 different banks and were turned down. So,
oh, wow. Yeah.
But it wasn't because of our color.
Mm-hmm.
It was because really we were talking about co-housing and they thought,
right. Yeah, that's still a new thing. Yeah, I appreciate that.
So thank you for the information, which is very important that all of us understand where the root of the problem came from. It didn't just happen. It really was by design. Mm-hmm. That's appalling. It's horrible.
Yeah, the book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein is a really good book that covers the whole history of this and has a lot of good information from different parts of the country. That was a really good book for me to read, and then to start digging into this more for my own city.
Yeah, I was thinking that in our area here, the Pacific Northwest, one of our large minorities here are the natives, the Native Americans. Yeah. And I would really like to have those people in our community because they have a lot of knowledge, they have a rich cultural appreciation of the land and the place. And I haven't found the answer of how to do that or how to talk to them. I know I can't be condescending at all because that immediately stops any communication. Mm-hmm. But I haven't found the answer, and I think their situation may be a little different than other races because they used to own all this place.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, I mean, we're intruders in their land, and that's kind of uncomfortable.
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to trust. There are going to be people who don't want to hear anything that you have to say, who don't believe that you want diversity. So there'll be a lot of communities that are just like, okay, you know, we're here, y'all are there, and that's it. But really just trying to reach out to people who are willing to listen, who are willing to have dialogue. That's a great way to start the process, at least.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Other questions? Rains, I think I see your Rains.
Hi, Rains Betsy from Berkeley Co-Housing. Good to see you again, Crystal. And crew. I just on related to the last question. We were doing some work with and hope to after the conference organize some visits to Try on Life Community Farm. more of a co-living community, but an eco-village inside Portland city limits that's really been innovating, having groups led by Native people of color and trying to integrate and form common understanding and spending time, not going to a lowest common denominator, but
first by they had built this fabulous cob sauna sweat house that, I mean, it's not a sweat house, but they then used it and invited marginalized groups, specifically Native American and transgendered youth, to use it for their own gatherings. And now Rains just came back from visiting, and they're so offering space, if you have the privilege of having space, offering that to groups who don't have access to space at that time. And I think you told me that now Tryon Farm is like invited those that group to come sponsor events on their land, as well as use
they actually have two groups of collectives, one of which is specifically people of color led to make sure they don't get crowded out. And I think I've seen a lot of groups try to build in more appreciation and awareness.
So in a somewhat follow-up, I wondered, Crystal or any of you, well, certainly let me acknowledge that resegregation is happening here in Berkeley. I think it's somewhat covered a little bit in the book, some of the covenants here in Berkeley, but the resegregation is so disturbing. But I wonder if any of you have experienced or know of either a forming group or an existing group that is Black-led or co-led in a way that leads you to be somewhat more encouraged about, not depending on white communities to welcome others in, but rather how can we be inspired by the example of Black-led communities or experiments that you're aware of?
Yeah, maybe Karen can answer that. As far as co-housing, I don't know of any people of color-led communities. I know the group somewhere in California, the People of Color Sustainable Housing Network, they're working on kind of a land trust model. But, it's hard for me to think of a lot of people of color groups.
Surfacing of something back east. I keep hoping.
There was a DC group, I don't know its current status.
And there was
a Muslim group in Chicago, yeah.
But I'm wondering if Jackson, Cooperative Jackson, or anything's going on there.
Just there, might be able to,
well, around housing cooperatives.
Yeah, there's a lot of history of Black people in America creating kind of their own collective housing, but also those collectives tended to be very political. So you think of the Black Panthers and MOVE. So a lot of those were kind of, dissolved by force because of their radical views.
I've heard it said, and I'm just curious whether you think this is true, that in many minority cultures, they're actually way better at creating a sense of community already as compared to white people who are lousy at it. And therefore, there's a theory that
definitely
part of the struggle of getting minorities to join the co-housing movement may be that they don't need it as badly as Caucasians do. And I'm curious what you would think about that, Crystal.
Yeah, that's been my experience. In my home community, we all know each other. The neighborhood is very close-knit. So when I went to college and when I, encountered white people, kind of the white majority culture, it was kind of this sense that, they felt like they didn't have a culture, they didn't have people that they could connect with, so they were creating their own, smaller communities, whereas I felt like I had people back home who supported me. So I think that can be probably something that plays into the idea of, well, we don't need to go out and, build a whole community because we already have people that we're close with. Black Americans are more religious most of the time. And like I said, because of housing segregation, they're already kind of closer together. So they have those kind of close connections already.
Makes a lot of sense. So many factors go into play, don't they?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Christina. Thank you for that comment in question. And I just want to echo what Crystal's saying, coming from a family that is very close and connected. And not just my immediate family, but those whom I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody was connected, and you can go across the street and ask for butter and sugar, and if someone needed help with a sitter, then grandma down the street could watch the child, that person's child for them. It was that kind of connection that I grew up in, that I think is still relevant today. But at the same time, I do still feel that within communities, no matter what race or background, there is still a disconnect that's happening. And just to add to the other factor of particularly African Americans looking into co-housing with the concept that they're not interested in living with less, because the majority of the population has gotten away from the simplicity of life and has now gotten into having more is best, having more is better. And most of the co-housing that I've researched and that I'm currently getting involved in, is the lifestyle of simple, simple lifestyle, minimalist, if that. But that concept to those groups, or African Americans, particularly families, that's a struggle. And so you have to, I guess, look at, is co-housing willing to allow a more materially accumulative value to be a part of their mission or vision of their co-housing, and that might attract more diverse group as well. But it's hard to tell.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that a lot of white families that have owned property before may be trying to downsize from a McMansion to, something simpler, whereas you'll have Black families that don't have that history of home ownership. So they've always had, a smaller house. And so when they're moving into a new community, a lot of people a lot of the co-housing people may be saying, well, we want less, but for a Black family that hasn't ever had more, less seems like, okay, well, I have to settle now.
Mm-hmm. Interesting how that different experience, different history through generations still plays out with having a very different sort of need and expectation around ideal housing. Yeah. Thank you both, Christina and Crystal, for bringing those topics up.
So I have a comment about that. This is Jenny again. It's actually white privilege to say we are moving into co-housing in order to simplify and downsize. So that's making some basic assumptions to even say that. And I have another comment on what we were talking about a minute or two earlier, kind of a sad joke that I say co-housing is us white people learning to live in community the way the rest of the world does. We have to learn how to support each other and nurture each other and be good neighbors with each other. And we have to learn how to do that. The rest of the world already does.
Yeah, and that's that's the downside of white privilege, is that there's been created like suburbs, kind of disconnected people, and consumerism, disconnected people. So there's definitely downsides to being white as well.
And just a quick comment. This is Christina again. We are looking at the diversity in terms of race. However, I think we should really look and celebrate that diversity just within the community itself. And that diversity can come from all different areas. It can come from what kind of lifestyle the person lives, or what kind of diet they have, or what kind of parents or non-parents they come from, old and young. I mean, different backgrounds within that diversity, personalities So sometimes we don't necessarily have to look at the race per se to be diversified, but just to focus and celebrate on the diversity that already is within the members or within the community or the neighborhood itself.
That's a great point, that diversity doesn't have to mean only race. We often use that as though that's the only thing it means, but that there's lots and lots of ways to have diversity, and all of them will challenge us in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and how can we be receptive and appreciate those different types of diversities, even within the co-housing community itself, irrelevant of the race.
Right. So just being generally appreciative and welcoming of diversity, both for the richness it brings and the challenge that it brings.
Correct.
And whether that's race or other kinds of diversity, that there's just a welcoming of that's part of the culture.
Yes.
Or to be intentional about making it part of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Crystal, any chiming in on that?
I went to Earth Haven, which is in North Carolina, and they're one of the oldest intentional communities in the country. And I made like this comment to one of the community members saying, "Oh, you're all pretty similar. How do you have disagreements?" And he said, we may all kind of have similar. We may be all mostly white. We may mostly be middle class, but we all have so many differences, and those differences are what cause most of the conflict in co-housing or any kind of intentional community. And that's something that has to be worked out just as much as you have to work with anti-bias and racism.
Great.
So I don't know, may I speak, Betsy, here?
Yeah.
I wanted to build on a couple of different things that I'm hearing. One is that for me, part of my own white awakening, or just being more actively present with the terrible past and present of Black-white relations, or Black, the racial oppression, is to think, is that I hear many conversations going into different types of diversity. Oh, we have youth, or we have people who like folk dancing versus, that I hear white people often trying to be more hopeful by talking about other kinds of diversity rather than the racial segregation that is a reality, whether it's conscious or not. So I just want to acknowledge that for myself, that I'm less patient with that, but I really appreciate the generosity of spirit, because the truth is that it's the personality differences that often, we'll fight to the death over. You're low risk, I'm high risk. I want to think creatively, and you don't really like having strangers in the common house, let's say. So I just want to acknowledge that, our fiercest differences are not physical or even cultural history. Not that that isn't a real challenge, but just to acknowledge that living in community. And third, I was very hopefully grateful when this national survey that one of our members of the Co-Housing Research Network brought to the table, showing, and maybe you already spoke to this, I came in late, Crystal, but showing finding that there were no actual differences between people's interest in something vaguely co-housing-ish, but it was knowing your neighbors and being able to get together with them for social activities and mutual support. That there was actually a slightly greater interest among Black Americans, and but that essentially about 20 to 25% of Americans, regardless of education level, race, and income, were interested in the idea of knowing your neighbors and making decisions together, and knowing your neighbors and getting together for mutual benefit. I mean, it is such a natural human thing in most of the world. Anyway, I was grateful to hear that that wasn't just an artifact of white middle class privilege. That was hopeful for me.
Yeah, that was really good research, and I love seeing it. You know, it cuts across race, gender, socioeconomic status. You know, everybody, not everybody, but you know,
Yeah.
a large percentage of lots of people want to live in co-housing.
Or like you say, a neighborhood where we know each other. It's, you know, it isn't that we have to build new buildings and discover the joys of eating together with neighbors sometimes.
Yeah.
We don't have to create new community, but that's been the way of the co-housing movement.
Yeah. And that makes me think of affordable housing, which is kind of an issue that happens, you know, that's kind of getting more popularity, especially in Charlotte, is that co-housing usually isn't affordable housing. You know, it usually has a bit higher cost to create. So bringing in the focus on how do we create affordable housing, maybe by doing infill or renovating, you know, can we make it more affordable so that more diverse people can be a part of co-housing?
So I'll give a shout out to Durham and the Durham Land Trust, or Community Orange County Land Trust, there for supporting this neighborhood near Duke, a historically Black neighborhood that was supported to create their own plan, the elders and the people there to create their own plan for diversifying the neighborhood without losing it. So again, without having to build an entire complex, making it repopulating the neighborhood that had a lot of vacant homes in a way that supported the historically Black community and elders there. Another very encouraging story. I know it's in North Carolina, so also.
It's clear we have much more we could talk about with all of this. Such a fascinating topic. And Crystal, thank you for bringing it.
Yeah.
I think most of you know that the web chat topics are chosen by the presenters. And as long as it relates to co-housing, the association's pretty open to whatever folks want to bring. And I'm delighted, Crystal, that you brought this particular topic to our web chat series. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I want to do our public service announcement that these web chats are brought by the CoHousing Association. And that association is a nonprofit that is funded by donations and sponsorship. So if you like the web chats program, we'd certainly encourage you to make donations to that program. And you can do that through the website at cohousing.org, and we'd be glad to receive those. The other big news with the association, although I think most of you have heard it, is that we do have a conference coming up. And Crystal, you'll be with us there, I think, yes?
Yep, I'll be there.
And is this your first co-housing conference?
No, this will be my second national conference. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to say anything about encouraging folks to come or anything of that nature?
Well, I think it'll be a really good conference. You know, I love the way that you do the tracks of living it, you know, forming, and all those different topics that go in. So it'll be great for people who are already in co-housing and for people who are looking for co-housing. There's so much stuff that you can do in those 2 days. It'll be really great.
Wonderful. We look forward to seeing you there, getting to see you in person. And on a related topic to Joe Cole, and as you mentioned, what he's doing at conference as well. So more on this topic in Portland, and many opportunities to talk informally also there. Get the word out. If you know folks who are thinking they want to go and haven't registered yet, they should do that. We actually are looking at potentially selling out of conference registrations this conference. Really excited about all the great energy we're going to have there. Lots of people wanting to come. And so we're thrilled, but also wanting to let people know if you're definitely planning to come, then definitely register sooner than later, because we do think it could happen that we run out of spots for folks, which would be unfortunate, but also very exciting. It means co-housing's growing and the interest in co-housing is growing. It also means we have an amazing conference team, so I just keep wanting to shout that out, that our conference coordinators in the Northwest who've been working on this have been working incredibly hard and it shows. They put together a great program, and a lot of folks are interested. So looking forward to the conference in Portland. Want to make mention of our next web chat. We are not having a web chat next week. It's the first week we've taken off in a while. But then we're going into a busy April for web chats. I think we might actually get 6 web chats in April if my count is right. The first of those will be with Liz McGill on Tuesday. We've had sort of a run of Wednesdays, so if you've become a regular, note that the next one is on a Tuesday, April 2nd, and that will be Liz McGill talking about conflict, interpersonal or systemic. So more systems thinking. Similar in some ways to what we did tonight. So looking forward to that. Any last words, Crystal, before we sign off?
No, thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for being here. It's a great topic. Karen, did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I put some links into the chat for the Portland conference site, the web chat schedule, which also has the link to the videos, and donating to CoHo-US. So it's all right there, easy for you. And I also, excuse me, plugged in a link earlier about the book that Crystal mentioned. So I plugged that in there.
Wonderful. All right. Thanks, everybody. See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Crystal.